I'd like to welcome you to this excellent, soon-to-be excellent conversation with a terrific panel. I'd like to bring your attention to the cultural brochure that was on your seat to look at other offerings and see if there's anything more. We have another panel at 4. We have 2 tomorrow and 1 more on Tuesday. And I'd appreciate your attendance at any and all of those. I want to be sure to tell you that this is being live streamed and will be on Facebook and will be there for a week and some. And then when edited, will go up on the website permanently, as is every panel we've done since the fall of 2016, which I think provides actually quite a great and interesting selection of topics, and we view it as an educational resource, which is why we take all these panels quite seriously and try to bring to you the highest level of, like I like to say, intellectual rigor. At the same time, I would ask you, on the other hand, to please check your cell phones. And even though you think you turned them off, it doesn't hurt to double check. Just always trying to leave a slight doubt in your head, so you'll take a look at them. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will introduce this prestigious panel. I'm very excited to have together. Doing something on Notre Dame has been something I'm thinking about for many, many months. It wasn't quite as easy to put together as I was hoping it would be, because the topic is so varied, and how you want to come at this topic is complex. So I think we have represented here as good a selection of experts as we could get. And to start it off with our moderator, David Darcy, who's correspondent for the Art newspaper. Take it away, David.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in on such a lovely day. I don't think you'll be disappointed. We're now 6.5 months since the fire at Notre Dame, and the panel that we've put together will discuss that tragedy and the challenge of how to rebuild a building that's a church, a monument, and a tourist destination that had about 30,000 visitors a day. We'll look at the French response so far, which I'm sure you've read about a bit in the newspaper, which there's been a lot of contention over that. Everything from leaving it alone to soliciting new contemporary designs. And when you bring up contemporary at a place like TEFAF, it's not always on the positive side. Also the challenge of paying for a job that's estimated to cost about $1 billion. And there's a story in itself about all the money that's rolled in so far. And then there's a question of how to restore a building that is a restored building, that was restored substantially, some may say built again in the 19th century by a famous architect. And then we'll compare this task with the task of the preservation of other damaged sites, or the decision not to preserve. So let me introduce our panelists. I'm going to be brief in their identification. If I was exhaustive in it or complete in it, we wouldn't have time to talk about anything else. We have Olivier Meslay, who is the director of the Clark Art Institute. Jorge Otero-Pailos, who is a professor and director at Columbia University of Historic Preservation. Bonnie Burnham, former director of the World Monuments Fund. And Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic of the New York Times. Now, if that isn't a dream team, I don't know what is. All right. So let's start talking to Olivier Meslay. Olivier, I was struck at the time of the fire by the impact on the French population of that tragedy, something that seemed much more spiritual than I expected in secular France, and much more broader than I expected in a country where church attendance is not as great as it might have been 100 years ago. Was that a surprise to you?
It was a surprise, not only watching the French people reaction, but watching my own reaction. I remember I was in Williamstown when this happened, and I received a text from my wife saying, Notre Dame is burning. And I said, well, my first reaction was a quiet reaction. I've never been completely in love with Notre Dame because I think there was more beautiful churches. It was too touristy. It was for me a little bit a dry building sometimes. And then probably half an hour later, I had the opportunity to watch what was happening. And suddenly I was completely caught by the fire, and I was overwhelmed by my own emotional reaction. It was very, very interesting and I think it was the same for a lot of French people. As you mentioned, France is a very secular country. Now, probably less than 5% of the population goes to church, which probably, France is among the most secular country in the world. But at the same time, the French are extremely related to their own past and history. There is a strong identity, in national identity, and Notre Dame was obviously a very strong symbol of that. And I was not surprised because I was myself caught by surprise by my own reaction, and I think I saw the same reaction among my compatriots.
What did this fire reveal to us about the guardianship, the stewardship of what a lot of us outside France see as such a central site, a historical site, religious site, monument, tourist site central to the economy of Paris? Did this reveal any secrets about what should have been done, how this place should have been taken care of, the custodianship?
Yes. It's very difficult now. The investigation is not finished at this time. It's very difficult to know what really happened, and because of that, the stewardship and the responsibility of some part of the stewardship is difficult to determine at this moment. There was three options: or it was a default in the security system, or there was a problem with the construction company, or there was a default in the, I forgot the third.
The alarm system?
The alarm system was part of the
Security system.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry. Security system.
The security system. That means until it's finished, it's very difficult to determine what was the problem. There was one problem what was obviously existing was the communication between the alarm system, the people in charge, and the firefighter. To have the right firefighter coming, it took almost an hour with the long ladders. And this was probably something which was not planned properly. This is probably the most important thing. Beside that, it's very difficult at this moment to know who exactly was responsible for what happened.
Okay, given that relatively slow response, given the enormity of the tragedy, there seems to be administratively, politically, a very hasty response. Already a vote that this has to be restored exactly as it was, and the plan to have it ready by the Olympics in Paris of 2014.
Yes.
I'm 2024, excuse me. I'm sorry, 2024. God, you're right. This is what happens when you're dealing with dates in the last few hours. Is this overly ambitious?
This is an opinion, but I think it was a hasty answer. 5 years for me is a very short time to restore. And above all, when the fire was not even finished, I mean, it was not even extinguished, there was an answer about the timeline. I think it was premature for that. And it was I would not say it's a political answer. It is a sort of an announcement to plead the crowd, but also it is probably driven by an emotional agenda, which probably is not the right answer when you are a political figure.
Right. But there's another element, if we can call it that, to the emotional agenda, and that is that at a time when, before the fire, private foundations had been trying to raise about 150 million euros, the money comes rolling in. François Pinault pledges $113 million. Then, in response, Bernard Arnault pledges 226, not dollars, euros, 226 million euros. I wonder where he got that number. And then the Bettencourt pledge even more. Assuming that money is going to be coming in the French context, is there a challenge in integrating that much influence from private donors into a project like the rebuilding of Notre Dame? Or is this just generosity that is going to help do the job?
I think there is nobody, for what I know, there is no fear that these gifts will interfere with the rebuilding or with the cultural agenda of the French government. For me, that was not I would say, the problem. The problem was immediately, and even during the night when François Pinault, then Bernard Arnault announced their pledge, immediately the French created a controversy about why these people are giving this and benefit from tax deduction. And it is extremely damageable. This debate, this controversy has been extremely damageable because now there is among the parliament a wish to reduce the tax deduction for giving. Yes, it seems to be quite counterintuitive, but it is the case. Mm-hmm. And this is probably the most damageable effect of the fire for me. I mean, there is now a big controversy about the fact that people with wealth have too much tax deduction when they give.
Right, but and then by extension, it really won't hurt Pinault or Arnault terribly to have less of a tax deduction. But if that's applied across the board, many people with a lot less money might be discouraged.
Of course.
So their tax burden will be increased disproportionately since they're giving less money.
And there was inside this pledge, there was debates about the fact that François Pinault said, I will give my money without tax deduction, and Bernard Arnault was not mentioning anything. No, it is a really damageable debate at this moment, because in fact, since 2003, with this new code of tax deduction for charities and cultural projects has been put in place, the philanthropy of French people have almost doubled. If we stop this, it will be extremely damageable to the French heritage, to French museums, because at the same time, the French government and the cities are diminishing their support. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the way we're structuring this is as a conversation. I'd like to ask does anybody here have any questions for Olivier on some of the themes that he's just been discussing? Okay. Well, let's move to Jorge. Jorge, talk about the fact that we're talking about the restoration of a restored building. We're talking about a building that, in its state, the morning of April 15th, was a much restored building from its original building.
Right. Well, every building that has lasted that long has been heavily restored at one point or another, and that's kind of, how a building lasts is because we intervene in it. Otherwise, the gutters would be full of leaves, and, maintenance is a really important part of this. Preservation is a very important part of this. I think what's interesting about this building in particular is that when major restoration campaigns happen, it has typically been the case that there have been some major political shifts. So there was a major fire in 1225 to 1230 that created the impetus for the construction or the finishing of the church, the building of the buttresses, a new roof. This is the roof that just burnt. All of that was done under a monarchy that has a long line that goes up to the French Revolution. And it is during the French Revolution that Notre Dame becomes the object of a lot of anger from the revolutionaries, and becomes, heavily destroyed. The Western works are attacked, and that's a major political upheaval. So we have to think of that by the 1830s, when the July monarchy of Louis Philippe brings back the monarchy to France, all of those symbols of the monarchy were really hated. I mean, these were things that people didn't want to see. But when Louis Philippe comes in, he wants to restore the symbols of the monarchy and of the church. And so he starts putting money into this. And one of the things that happens, which is really of global consequence, is that he creates what they first called the Comité des Arts, but then they call the Comité des Monuments Historiques in 1830. So right when he comes into power, and he starts restoring buildings of the monarchy and churches. That is the first such service in the world. And our National Park Service, which gets created in 1916, almost a full century later, was modeled on the French service. So we have a major political shift giving rise to preservation as we know it, modern preservation as we know it. As a result of it, when they first look at Notre Dame, it is in such bad shape that city officials were considering tearing it down. And the first director of the Monument Service, Ludovic Vité, puts out a big report about the state of churches and monuments in France that is so damning that everyone is completely depressed. How are we going to pay for all this? These churches are in bad state. That same year, you have Victor Hugo's publishing the novel that we all know as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is the novel Notre Dame de Paris. And in that novel, he gets everyone excited about the importance of this monument to the French history, to the memory of France, what Olivier was mentioning, all these things that are not just religious. So here's a novelist that gets everyone excited about a building that has all the wrong meanings, and gets people on both sides of the political equation to just, want to support it. And as a result of that, they hire the wrong architect to restore it, which is Godet, who was a terrible restorer. He introduced cement and cast iron into traditional masonry and made all sorts of debacles. Everyone realizes he's the wrong guy, and so they have a competition. Just like we're having a competition now. And that competition in 1844 is won by the two men on the screen, by Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Antoine Lassus. He was 30 years old, Viollet-le-Duc, when he won that competition. And he won that competition with a program to bring back the church to the 13th century, which was a radical idea at the time. I mean, I think it's really hard for us to realize that building a building à l'identique, like to try to, which by the way, nobody had seen this building à l'identique, so it's a kind of imagination what this might have been in the 13th century. That was a radical idea at the time, and he was able to present a series, maybe we can have a couple of the next slides. He was able to present a project that showed the completion of the Western work with some two spires. Those were never built, because Lassus thought that they were too heavy, and that he said, look, in living memory, nobody's seen these spires, so we can't really build this. It's going to change everybody's perception of this. He also had a much bigger spire at the crossing, if you can see it over there in the elevation on the left. And maybe we can have the next, sure, which gives you a better sense of what they had planned. Now, of course, this was voted on at the assembly, and the assembly said, this is a bit too big of a budget for us. You're going to have to cut down your budget, and so they cut down about a third of the budget. But in the process, what I think is really important to realize is people criticize Viollet-le-Duc, but he was the first to really go up on a scaffold and do analysis, forensic analysis of the building. He's the one that discovered traces of smoke that he dated to 1225 to 20, and said, there was a fire here before. He discovered traces of the original tracery of the 12th century Gothic church windows and rose windows. He realized that the big rose window was tilted 15 degrees forward and was about to fall down, and had it deconstructed and reconstructed so that it was plumb. So he was a proper investigative preservationist. He wasn't a willy-nilly, let's make this in whatever style we kind of imagine the past to be. He was a kind of archaeological thinker. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, because preservation is a way of understanding the past that is a way that is about putting your hands in it. So it's not just looking at the past, but we learn from the past by taking it apart. That's what a preservationist does. And Viollet-le-Duc taught us to do that and putting it back together. I think it's very different what we're looking at today. When we have a competition that says, let's put a new spire on the building, there is no sense in that competition that says, let's study the building and learn something from it, and out of those lessons, then come up with a project. So it's all about the present. That spire is supposed to symbolize us and our omnipotence, of the presence, to build in our image a spire for Notre Dame, which I think is just completely wrong-headed, because it undermines every idea about preservation, that preservation should come out of a kind of study of the past. It's not projective. It can be a little, projective, but there's a balance between projection and archaeological study. And so it's that balance that is lost in the current proposal to do a new competition. And I thought it was shameful, the way that architects just sort of threw, spires of all different kinds in the week right after the fire. Titanium this, glass that, we'll put a roof garden on it. I mean, it was just like, absolutely no consideration for the history, the lessons, what preservation means.
The one thing I haven't seen is a suggestion that they put a 70-story residential skyscraper by Jean Nouvel on top of it to pay the bills.
Right.
But I don't think all the petitions are in yet. So
that could still happen.
But seriously, back to you for a second, Olivier. Institutionally, how do you take a step back once this grand gesture of doing this with historical exactitude in 4 years, let's call it the 5-year plan, once this has been out there, endorsed by the President of the Republic, how do you take a step back in France?
I think you underestimate the power of the bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, but in a good way. In a good way. I think that...
In other words, the bureaucracy can slow anything down.
In this case, and in a positive way. That means there is a, as you were just, Jorge was just saying, it is the longest existing bureaucracy about preservation worldwide. Mm-hmm. There is rules, they have traditions, mm-hmm. but they have also a lot of power, because it's a very established, very organized. For sure, it's too slow, it's too bureaucratic, it's everything, but they are knowledgeable. It is probably one of the most knowledgeable network on architect, curators of objects, and something which is probably as important as everything, which is the craftsmen. The craftsmen in France probably I'm too patriotic on that, but they are among the best, they are among the best craftsmen. And for this reason, there is a lot of people that are involved in this discussion, and the most powerful, in my opinion, will be the bureaucracy. I could be more too optimistic, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to agree with this and say, I mean, my impression from talking to people there in recent weeks is that the bureaucracy will, in fact, win out here, because there is, I mean, let me just step back and say, I think I agree very much with something Jorge said, which is that a lot of the change comes out of a political circumstance. And in this case, Macron was given this tremendous gift of the fire. in the sense that he was having, a very divided country with these protests by the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. And this fire happened and brought people like Olivier and millions of people around the world together and presented him with an opportunity about a unified France, a notion of what it means to be a nation, because this building, after all, is what makes it so interesting. Even to me as a journalist, when I was asked suddenly to write about it because I was told there was a fire, and I thought, that's insane, and I looked, and then I saw the numbers of people who were turning to the Times website. Right. There was this outpouring, and it gave Macron, I think, this opportunity to say, let us come together as a nation and use this as a symbol. And one of the things, his immediate response was, we'll hold a competition and we will, do this thing in time for the Olympics. I think it was very opportunistic in a not wonderful sense. But and for a variety of reasons, I think that he's already backing off the idea of the competition. But the truth is that they've made so little progress, even in these 6.5 months, that it's simply, I leave it to Jorge and others and Bonnie and others who know this well, but this is an immensely complex project, and the notion of actually getting this done in any reasonable way, such an important project in something like 5 years, nobody I've talked to involved with this project or anywhere near it believes that's a reasonable thing to do. So the question will be politically what's expedient for Macron, and then how can this very strong and as Olivier says, entrenched and also incredibly sophisticated bureaucracy achieve the right end in whatever time that takes, which I assume will be twice as long as that.
What do you think of a 5-year plan, Bonnie?
Yes, it's completely unrealistic. They haven't even figured out how to take down the scaffolding that was put in place in order to start the restoration during which the fire started. And they don't know what kind of conditions they're going to find when they start assessing the stones and the impact that the heat and the age of these stones will have in terms of how much weight the building will be able to carry and how much ballast it will need in order to stabilize. And that will obviously tremendously influence the eventual design. So it's a step-by-step process that the bureaucrats, as has been noted, have down to perfection. They know how to do this kind of intervention. They never imagined that they would be called upon to replace the roof and the spire of Notre Dame, but the capacity is there.
But
Technically, it's possible, but it's certainly not something that's going to happen on a schedule.
Yeah, forgive me, Bonnie. I just want to say, last I was there a couple weeks ago, this was described to me as a continuing state of emergency because of this cascade of problems that the lead not only created a public relations disaster, but also, and had problems in the neighborhood, but creates problems for people to go in and work on the site. And now the scaffolding with its twisted, fused, which had been there from the restoration, they don't know what's going to happen if that falls. So there's a series of problems to be solved before one can even really go in and make the analyses, because it's hard even to get people in there.
They're talking about having robots do the examination of the conditions inside. Yeah. And so I'm sure they don't have these robots in place. So that in itself, the technical range of technical possibilities today of doing innovative things in order to bring about the ultimate treatment is so tantalizing that you could spend 60 years doing this restoration. And what I'm going to be talking about in a little while is a church that actually took 60 years to reconstruct.
Remember, it took Viollet-le-Duc 20 years. So, okay, let me find your first, now. Excuse me, guys, how do I turn this? Okay. While they're doing that, Bonnie, you and I talked about the comparisons with two projects, one of which was Coventry, the other of which was in Dresden at the Frauenkirche. While they're working on this, can you
Sure.
start talking about that?
So I thought it would be interesting to take a step back because whatever happens with Notre Dame will become part of history and part of the history of conservation in the way that people who work in this field take their examples from the past and apply them when new challenges arise. And so I thought I would take a step back and talk about two churches that were destroyed and how, as a result of war, and which have their own internal story as well, since it's in a sense the destruction of one led to the destruction of the other one. And the fact that they occupy opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the kinds of opportunities or choices that these bureaucrats, the authorities, can make in a circumstance like this. It's a kind of continuum with the most conservative kind of intervention on one end, which is to do nothing, just like people have talked about in the dialogue after the event, and on the other end of the spectrum, to completely rebuild something that has been completely destroyed. So those are the brackets. And just to talk about them quickly.
Sure, can we, now, Tommy, let me get to your slide.
Yeah, that's
Okay, go ahead.
where I was going to start. This is Coventry Cathedral. On the night of November 16th, 1940, during the course of the Blitz of the German Luftwaffe, blitzing British cities, terrorizing the population, trying to demoralize the English into surrendering in World War II. And during the course of this bombing, Coventry Cathedral took a direct hit. And you can see from this horrific picture that there are some walls standing, but basically the whole cathedral collapsed. The roof collapsed, everything was burned, all the windows were destroyed. And in the middle, if you can see it well enough, there's a couple of burned roof timbers in the shape of a cross. And that wasn't actually a cross on the church, but those two burned beams were kept by an artist and set up at the site and became a kind of symbol of what the British considered to be an act of complete infamy that this church had been targeted as part of this aggression that started World War II. And so their philosophical approach to what to do with Coventry Cathedral after the fact, and again, it was artists and people in the literary world and others who kept this dialogue alive of what are we going to do, what are we going to do about Coventry, that led to steps after the war, but it took until about 1950 for the British government to decide that they were going to have a competition. And the competition is not for the reconstruction of this church. It was decided that the memory of this event had to be preserved in and of itself. And so the Coventry Cathedral of the Gothic period, which was actually the second Coventry Cathedral, there's an earlier church almost right next to it that survived the bombing, much smaller basilica. The decision was made to build a brand new Coventry Cathedral that would be a statement of our time of triumph over infamy and that would engage the greatest artists of the day. And so Coventry Cathedral in the next picture was built, starting in around 1954 and completed in the middle 60s with contributions by artists, Graham Sutherland, who did the windows, Sir Jacob Epstein, Piper, and others, all made contributions to this church. And it took on a life of its own as a kind of aspirational place from the religious perspective to aspire to redemption, and as a place of reconciliation from the human perspective to try to bring people back together who have come to blows over difficulty. So the old remains of the church that you see actually not adjacent to, but built right into the new church, have become a place where there are many tributes to atrocities that have occurred since World War II, where people from all over the world are invited to come and create some kind of a tribute to an event, to an individual, that this place has become a place of remembrance. And one more picture of Coventry. World Monuments Fund was involved just a few years ago in the stabilization of the ruins, because although they decided to set them aside forever as a gesture of remembrance, nobody remembered that the ruins had to be maintained in order to be preserved. And so they were on the verge of falling down when WMF got involved. And one of the interesting things that we learned was that the crypt of the old church, which was opened at the time, was full of the stones that had fallen during the bombing. And they had just been kind of gathered up, swept up, put into the crypt. The crypt was closed and never opened again. And I think that's an indication that from day one, the British never even considered rebuilding this church as it had been. They really wanted it as a symbol of an event more than anything else. And if Coventry needed a cathedral, we had to start over from scratch. So granted, these are wartime events, and what happened with Notre Dame had nothing to do with that
Right.
kind of hostility.
Right.
But nevertheless, it occupies one end of the spectrum.
Right. The difference between the destruction of war and the possibility of a workman leaving a cigarette somewhere. Right. Okay. You want to talk about Dresden?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
No, I just think these are amazing stories.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
doesn't have much
Yeah.
of an opportunity to tell.
Yeah. Next
Go-
slide.
Go on.
Okay.
So, in the last days of the war, 1945, in retaliation for the bombing of Coventry Cathedral, the British, with support from the United States, conducted the firebombing of Dresden on the excuse that it was one of the biggest industrial cities in Germany, but it was really a gesture of retaliation, as everyone knows. And in the very center of this picture, that tall structure is a church called the Frauenkirche. I don't think there's any question whatsoever that that church was targeted as part of this retaliatory gesture. And it completely fell. It was a very, very tall dome, as you'll see, and all those stones fell in place. After the war, Dresden ended up in East Germany. It's a Lutheran church, not a Catholic church. And the East German government decided to leave the ruins exactly as they were, as a memorial to the war and to what happened in Dresden. But after the reunification of Germany, artists and literary figures and others started rattling sabers for we have to do something about the Frauenkirche, we have to do something about the restoration of our city. We have to have Dresden be what it was before the war, as it still survives in our memory, even though the whole city was really still rubble. And so this huge effort was launched, a lot of it through private fundraising campaigns on an international scale. There was someone here in the United States who led the creation of a Friends of Dresden. IBM volunteered the technology to figure out exactly what stones survived, and these stones had been sitting there on the ground, subjected to weather conditions for 50 years at that time. So it's really kind of spectacular that anything survived that could have been reused, but they reused everything that they had and only filled in small gaps, and were able, with this spectacular 21st century computer program, to reconstruct the church from the rubble, really like Phoenix rising from the ashes. And so we can look at a picture of Dresden Cathedral. That's during the process, almost at the end of the reconstruction that was occurring now in the early years of 2000, it's finished in 2004. The overall cost was 180 million euros, just as a comparative. And next picture. You can see its importance on the skyline of the city as the other buildings around the Frauenkirche, which were also reconstructed. This major effort to bring a city back to what it had been before this catastrophe, and which still lived in people's memories. Dresden was put on the World Heritage List in 2004. And so this was a big push to bring it back into the international world of respect for what something had once been one of the great cities of the world. Ironically, Dresden was listed on the World Heritage List as a cultural landscape, meaning that because they didn't actually have the monumental buildings when they started working on the designation, the nomination to the World Heritage List, they took the whole city and its surroundings into the definition. And a few years later, they decided to build a huge, somewhat intrusive 4-lane bridge over the river within view of the church. The World Heritage Committee said this is not acceptable. It really defaces the cultural landscape, and the city of Dresden asked to have the World Heritage status removed. It's one of only 2 sites that's been de-designated. The other one is a nature preserve in Oman, where the species that was being protected has almost completely died out, and the size of the preserve was very much diminished. So I think you can see the symbolic value and the huge emotion that's associated with these events. And I'm sure that even though these are wartime events and something that we need to keep in our memory as time goes on, I think Notre Dame will have just as much import for people in the future.
Michael, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I lived in Germany for some years, and you know, the Germans have done more work on this kind of question of preservation and memory than anyone, and you know, and there are so many different ways of doing it. I lived very near a place called the Gedächtniskirche, which was basically West Germany's ruin that was left in the same way as a kind of like Coventry, as a in this case also as a cautionary tale for the German people. You know, much of the East Germany was reconstructed as if nothing had happened by the East Germans, East Berlin, I mean. And then, you know, after many years, the last piece of the Museum Island, which was the Neues Museum, was very interestingly reconstructed, but also sort of newly conceived by an architect named David Chipperfield as a kind of palimpsest of all of the histories of that building and that site, and then what had happened during the war. So this is interesting. I think, David, you said it, though. You know, a guy may have left a cigarette next to an open wire, and what is that? I mean, you know, if we're talking about these kind of events to buildings that have been interestingly and rethought, Rem, you know, Cathedral and Chartres even, and obviously these sites, then you're talking usually about something that this new iteration memorializes, but also somehow encapsulates. I don't really know what that is here, and I think that is also part of the lack of enthusiasm generally for a kind of new, you know, forget some of these ambulance-chasing proposals that came out, but for some sort of new conception of the building. But I just wanted to say, the interesting thing in this case, I'm just curious what you guys think as well, is after all, the spire that collapsed was a construction of Viollet-le-Duc.
Right.
And Viollet did invent this notion of preservation, this very way in which we look at these historical buildings and their architectural history as something we need to preserve or think about. And so it seems to me Notre Dame has this very special role, even if it's not the most beautiful Gothic cathedral, even if we didn't really love it as much as we did some of it. It's so important, and part of its importance is Viollet's role in recreating it. And so I've heard a number of people articulate as well this idea, well, actually, what we need to restore is, even if it's not the original, is Violet's reconstruction, reimagination of the building, because that in itself is kind of the important historical legacy here. Not the echt Gothic, which that spire is long gone, but this thing, this idea of the preservation of the building itself.
So it's preservation as opposed to our own reconstruction of the building from our period.
Yeah, and by the way, in defense of Jean Nouvel, he was the architect who came out and said they should reconstruct the building as it was, including the spire by Violet. I mean, not the, the wood-beamed superstructure, but the, yeah. So,
Right.
yes, but that's right.
I was just using Nouvelle
That's okay.
because it happens to be above a
Yes.
building that was just rebuilt after only 15 years or 20 years, however many.
True.
Jorge, reaction?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that you brought up war, and as a kind of political tipping point that really did cause a major rethinking about preservation. The post-war reconstructions were a major moment in preservation and in culture. And so I think one of the things that for me Notre Dame gives us an opportunity to do is to think about what is our current geopolitical moment, which is a kind of haze. It's very difficult to kind of understand what is going on geopolitically, and we kind of see through the fog, little silhouettes of things, but it's not like a kind of, clear, battle of good and evil, or it's not the kind of World War II. So it is being able to see through that fog. There's moments like I think you can see through the fog in little kind of flashes, and I think that Notre Dame gives us some of those.
But think about 2015, after those attacks that killed so many people, not all that far from Notre Dame. The official memorial was at Notre Dame. People came not because this was a church, but this was a gathering place for those events. Is this a little bit about what Michael was talking about? In other words, this reassertion of Notre Dame as that kind of place, almost beyond religion.
It has to be beyond religion in France, because as I was saying, France is no more a country of believers. It is a very, very tiny part of the population. But Notre Dame is, through the preservation, through the restoration, through the transformation over almost 900 years, is at the center of the French identity. Just a sort of very practical anecdote about Notre Dame. If you are in Strasbourg, if you are in Toulouse, if you are in Marseille, when you calculate the number of kilometers, you do that with Notre Dame in the center. It is an official center of France. I mean, it is not, and for a country which is so secular, it's interesting that the church is, this church, not another church, this church is at the center.
Well, we could call that ground zero if that didn't have such overtones.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what it is.
Kilometer zero.
Kilometer
Oh.
zero.
There it is.
No, but it is. And if it is if you are 753 kilometers from Paris, not, you are 753 kilometers from Notre Dame. It's always this case, yeah.
It's kilometer zero.
Right.
But,
But to stand that on its head, before we take some questions from the audience, Notre Dame, the Communards wanted to burn Notre Dame in 1871.
As many other things, yeah.
Yeah, right.
But he didn't.
But Notre Dame has ceased, when we talk about, let's say, the retreat of the officially spiritual, the officially Catholic, no one wants to burn, no movement wants to burn down
No.
Notre Dame. No movement wants to make a statement by burning that cathedral down.
I don't know. I think though you'll probably find some people that want to.
Well, now, I mean,
Find some other way to
There's all
desecrate it.
sorts of, But one of the things is Notre Dame has been over the year. So I want to say to like one is that Notre Dame is a kind of ongoing laboratory for not only French culture, but also preservation culture. I mean, it's certainly the case. And at different moments, you can see different things happening there. Right. And we could talk about those. And so there is, I think that what Michael was saying, a kind of opportunity to think of it as a laboratory today for not only, French culture, which I think is what Macron seized upon. He wanted to make it a laboratory for a kind of new unified France, but it kind of backfired on him because he came up with like a 19th century solution. He's like, let us rebuild France by creating another monument.
Right.
And so I think he fundamentally misunderstood what preservation is today, which is it is a kind of social process. The object is something that is in relationship to people's desires, emotions, and we now recognize the importance of people's relationship to objects much more than Viollet-le-Duc did. Viollet-le-Duc was all about the object. He didn't really care, it was secondary.
But inside the Viollet-le-Duc structure, you had this accumulation of objects, fortunately all of which were taken out,
Right.
where the place seemed to breathe with those objects.
You mean the crown of thorns and so on?
Everything, yeah.
And they were created over time,
Right,
not all
right.
at once.
Although the illusion was that they were created over 8 centuries, of course that's not the case, because
Right.
these all accumulated since the place was reopened in 1864.
Right. Well, and so the thing is, if you think of it as a social process, I think already, if you think of preservation as a social process, already by the beginning of the 20th century, really, there was an attempt to get the church out of Notre Dame. Get rid of the priests, just make it a monument. No priests in there. And Proust fought very hard against that. Right. He said, if you take out the priests and if you take out the smell.
Yep.
Of the service,
right.
Then you kill the church. There is no monument.
Right. If you take out the priests, you get Albania.
Who?
You get Albania. You
Albania.
get the officially atheist, where you have religious structures preserved, but absolutely nothing
Exactly.
inside of it.
And he thought that was to misunderstand what these monuments, the potential of these monuments in a kind of social reality. So going back to that, now you mentioned tourism. We haven't talked about tourism, but the reality is that most of us connect to these monuments because of a kind of touristic experience in which some story is told about that country. But when we want to understand a culture, when we travel places, the first place we go is to monuments, maybe to a restaurant as well. But we go to, a monument and say, okay, what is this culture all about? And the story we get there is packaged. So what is the story that we're going to tell at Notre Dame? I hope that it's not the story of the 13th century, but that it would include something about the fact that in 2019, the place burnt because there was a systematic defunding of preservation over 20 years. For the whole 21st century, governments of the West have defunded their culture. And the result is that there was nobody to watch over the roof. And so it burnt. And it's not the only place that burnt. There's a ton of churches that have burnt before.
And it was an accident waiting to happen. Given the way it was constructed and given the way it had aged, it was just almost an inevitability.
Right. Okay, the Albanian comment, that was not made in levity. You have to, this is, if you look at what we've been talking about, it's an officially atheistic country where the churches have been emptied out, they're still standing, but what you feel more than anything is the emptiness when you visit them.
But David, the thing is, why are we talking about what the French government is going to be doing about Notre Dame? Because the French government is in charge of Notre Dame, not the church.
That's right.
That's true of all the monuments in France.
Right.
And 100 years ago, 112, in 1907 or whatever, the French went through a process. Which churches will belong to the church and which belong to us? And so if it's a church built by Corbu, then the church is in charge of it. If it's before that, it's not. And the reason I say this
The distinction is actually the cathedrals.
The cathedrals, right.
And then all the other churches belong to the township.
The townships, exactly.
And they may be more in alliance with the religious community in the town, and so they seem like they're more churches. But in fact, all those buildings were,
Right.
except the cathedrals, taken out of this state.
Right. Forgive me, the reason you raised the key point is I just want to say one thing, which is that Part of this issue of fundraising in the beginning with private funds
Right.
was about why is so much money going to Notre Dame, but not a lot of these other churches, which are, as Bunny says, actually so they're public, they're not the church, and they're run by the cities because the church really realized that they were falling apart. They didn't want to pay for the upkeep, so they leased this space. But in many French cities, there are multiple churches that are virtually empty, and which are not protected by heritage,
Right.
and which are being sold off or torn down. And of course, there were people in France who were saying, why is all this money going to this one church for tourists and not to? So, I mean, this relationship between church and state is very complex in France and raises larger issues about what should be preserved and by whom. But I think it's important to be saying the state of France is such that this is a conversation that's had at a state level and not as on a religious level. It's not the Vatican is not coming in to, sell off some jewelry in order to pay for the new roof.
And the public can talk about it as much as they want to, but the state will ultimately
Exactly.
make the decision.
Macron ultimately.
Right, right. So we have some time for some questions. 3 minutes. Okay, sir, be brief.
So if the French bureaucracy is that great, how come they didn't put any firewalls upstairs? How come they didn't put any sprinklers in the place? How come they didn't have a good fire alarms system? And today I learned they had no fire practice drills. So I'm not so. I wouldn't trust them that much.
Okay, well, the short answer is that's one bureaucracy, and there are other bureaucracies, but I'm sure there's a longer answer.
Well, no, very quickly, I would say that they did think about the firewalls, but because that roof was one of the few remaining roofs with timbers that dated back to the 8th century, because they were built in the 13th century, but they were like 400-year-old trees. They said, we can't break this up with firewalls because you won't be able to see this, what they called the forest. And so preservationists made the decision to go with this high-tech technology of fire alarms rather than firewalls. But it was so high-tech that they couldn't quite understand it. The other thing is, because of the precarity of jobs like surveillance official, or the person that was there had been on the job for a couple days, had no idea what they were looking at when the fire alarms went off. And this is a larger problem. You're awake.
Okay.
Well, the lousy system, I agree, but it's a lousy system that has to do also with the fact that you can put somebody in charge of a cathedral like that has only been there for a couple of days on the job. That's
But I think you've raised an interesting point, because even if, and I'm entirely in favor of completely reconstructing Notre Dame as it was. That's the way it needs to look, the way it looked in our memory, and those angels from the period of Viollet-le-Duc need to go back on the roof. But you could introduce new technologies that would prevent something like this from happening again by replacing those wooden beams with something else. I think the French tradition is to do it in the traditional way, and therefore it's most likely that they will choose that option.
Okay,
But there are lots and lots of changes that are occurring in how buildings are preserved against things like earthquakes, for example, that do involve the introduction of new kinds of technology that didn't exist when the building was built. So it is an option.
I have a quick question for you. Thank you for your talk. No one mentioned Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and I'm curious if you think that was a good idea, the way that it was completed, not according to the original plans by Gaudí.
Anyone want to answer that one?
One's for you, I think.
Jorge?
I think it's a different kind of problem because there was never a complete building, to respond to. So there was a kind of unfolding incompleteness, and he never left, pretty sophisticated models and plans, but they required, as all plans do, some level of interpretation when you actually get to the building site. And so they've done that. I think here it's a little bit different. This was a complete building that has been partially damaged. A lot of Notre Dame is still there. So it's, I think, more warranted in this case to try to look at what was there before. We have the documentation to try to approximate it. It will never, by the way, be the same. It doesn't matter how hard we try. You know, to say that something can be rebuilt identically is a little bit of smoke and mirrors, because when you actually get down to it, you do have to interpret as well. So, and there will be little details. I'm sure a mason will carve something in there, you know, showing.
Another question? No more questions? Okay. Let me make just one announcement. There is a drawing by Victor Coulbach, who's living in Paris, at the booth of Didier Aron here at TEFAF. The proceeds from that drawing will go to funding restoration. So, and take a look at it. We had a slide of it, didn't have time to put it on the monitor, but take a look at it at Didier Aron, all the way at the end of the central aisle. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. I expect you learned a lot today, right? This was a fantastic panel. I want to thank you all for coming. It's been you've been wonderful. This is a great conversation. And I hope we'll have a chance to continue it in one form or another, as it's ongoing, not just about Notre Dame, but this whole, so many issues you raised about preservation, authenticity, the purpose, how to, its relationship to the city, to the nation, etc. So many thanks to you again. Remember, it's live streamed and it'll be online. Please let your friends know, your colleagues, etc. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon.